In politics, what plays out in public is often very different from what happens in private. Leaders smile, shake hands, and pose for the cameras, but once the lights go off, the real discussions begin. This is especially true when it comes to America's closest partners. While Washington may believe the world still revolves around it, the truth is that a bigger shift is quietly taking place behind the scenes. Think about it. If the US can hit Canada, Europe, and Mexico with billion-dollar tariffs, countries that stood by its side for decades, what does that really say? The message is clear. Even America's closest allies aren't safe. Sure, world leaders still meet, exchange smiles, and say the right things in front of the cameras. But behind closed doors, they're preparing backup plans. And one ally, in particular, is now taking steps that would have seemed impossible only a few years ago. At the beginning of Trump's second term, the White House leaned once again on one of its favorite economic tools, tariffs. And they weren't aimed only at China. America's allies were also in the crosshairs. European products were taxed, Canadian steel and aluminum were taxed, and Mexican exports were hit too. Billions of dollars in duties suddenly burdened goods that had once crossed borders with ease. For Canada, the country most deeply tied to the US economy, this wasn't just a policy dispute. It was a threat to its very livelihood. Canada's Prime Minister described it as nothing less than a rupture. Prime Minister Mark Carney made it clear, this wasn't just a small quarrel over tariffs. In his words, it was a rupture, a sudden and dramatic break. For decades, Canada had assumed that US leadership in global trade was a given. Free markets and international cooperation seemed untouchable, and allies trusted that America would treat them differently from its adversaries. Trump's tariff-heavy second term broke that long-held belief. Canada, Europe, and Mexico suddenly found themselves treated no differently than any other competitor. Carney even remarked, half joking but half serious, that no country wants to wake up and check Truth Social just to find out what America's policy is that day. That's the level of uncertainty the US has created for its closest neighbors. So how has Canada responded? By turning east. Carney pointed out with pride that Canada has signed the most far-reaching trade agreement with the European Union ever achieved by a non-member country. And this isn't just a trade deal, it's also a partnership that ties economics and security together. As Carney explained, the agreement was signed at the end of June, and Canada is now on track to become a full participant in Europe's defense framework. That's a major shift. For decades, Canada's economic survival depended almost entirely on access to the American market. Now, Ottawa is intentionally weaving itself into Europe's economic system instead. And the results are already visible. Since the Canada-EU Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA, took effect on a provisional basis, trade between the two sides has grown by more than 30%. Europe has now become Canada's second-largest trading partner, right behind the US. But the biggest change may actually be in the realm of defense. By joining Europe's defense procurement system, Canadian industries are now becoming part of European supply chains, from aerospace to cyber defense. That's a fundamental shift, one that reduces Canada's dependence on Washington not just for trade, but also for security. And the strategy doesn't stop with Europe. Canada is also leaning on the CPTPP trade bloc, the very agreement the US abandoned, to strengthen ties across Asia. Through it, Ottawa gains preferential access to fast-growing markets like Japan, Vietnam, and Singapore. Carney even threw in a pointed remark for Washington, it's not too late to return. The message was unmistakable. Canada now has options. But perhaps the most unexpected move is its outreach to China. For years, Canada's approach to China was largely dictated by Washington. When the US pulled back, Canada pulled back. When Washington ramped up pressure, Ottawa often felt the consequences. Most famously during the arrest of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou in Vancouver, which triggered a major diplomatic standoff. But Carney is now hinting at a shift, what he calls selective engagement. Canada, he said, needs to be clear about where it will work closely with China and where firm limits must remain. He pointed to climate and engineering as areas where Beijing is not only open, but genuinely committed. This is a country led by engineers, he argued, and on climate issues, their involvement is more than just talk. China is the world's leader in solar panel manufacturing, dominates the global battery supply chain, and has poured billions into renewable energy. For Canada, a nation rich in resources, energy, and research institutions, that opens the door to cooperation with China in areas where their interests align. Of course, Ottawa isn't blind to the risks. Issues like security, privacy, and human rights are still major points of tension. But unlike Washington, which is drifting toward open confrontation, Canada is keeping the option of engagement on the table, cautiously and selectively. That marks a real break from tradition. It's Canada signaling that its foreign policy won't automatically follow America's lead, especially when doing so could come at a heavy economic cost. When you step back, the bigger picture is clear. Canada is no longer putting all its chips on Washington. Instead, it's embedding itself in Europe's rules-based system, strengthening its ties across Asia through the CPTPP, and even carving out limited areas of cooperation with China. As Carney put it in one striking line, "Think of Canada as a strong, sovereign, independent nation," Carney said, "one that is no longer relying only on the strength of its values, but also on the value of its strength." That's the shift underway, unfolding quietly but decisively in response to Trump's tariffs and America's growing unpredictability. But external partnerships only matter if the home front is secure. That's why Ottawa has been moving quickly to reinforce its domestic economy. Carney highlighted a wave of recent steps, cutting taxes on capital gains, dismantling interprovincial trade barriers, and pushing through legislation to fast-track hundreds of billions of dollars worth of projects in energy, artificial intelligence, and critical minerals. It's a broad and ambitious strategy. These sectors, energy, technology, and critical minerals, are set to shape the next global economy. And Canada doesn't want to play the role of a junior supplier to the United States. It wants to be a central player. The strategy is about hedging against future tariffs and ensuring Canada leads rather than follows. Why does this matter so much? Because Trump's tariffs exposed just how vulnerable Canada really is. As Carney explained, even if the US were to embrace full-blown protectionism again, Canada's domestic reforms could soften the blow. The goal is to build resilience now, so the country can withstand whatever comes later. In fact, estimates suggest that removing internal trade barriers could deliver a greater boost to Canada's economy than the worst possible outcome of a US trade shutdown. That's the hedge. Instead of hoping Washington never fires the shot again, Ottawa is preparing to survive if, or when, it does. On the security front, Canada is shifting gears as well. For years, Trump hammered NATO allies for not spending enough on defense. Now, Carney says Canada is reaching the 2% target this year, with plans to climb toward 5% by 2035. But there's a twist. Much of this new spending is dual use. Investments are flowing into artificial intelligence, cyber capabilities, drones, and critical minerals, areas that strengthen both national defense and the broader economy. So while Ottawa is answering Trump's NATO criticism, it's doing so in a way that builds independence rather than dependency. Step back and the landscape looks very different from just a few years ago. Canada is anchoring itself within Europe's trade and defense systems, while deepening its ties across Asia through the CPTPP. Canada is also cautiously re-engaging with China in areas like climate and resources, while strengthening its domestic economy to withstand the next tariff war. The era of blindly depending on the United States is ending. And the irony is hard to miss. Tariffs were meant to reinforce America's dominance, but instead, they've driven its closest ally to diversify, building insurance policies in Europe, Asia, and even Beijing. Leaders may still smile and shake hands at the United Nations, but behind closed doors they're preparing for a future where Washington is just one partner among many, not the only one. For Canada, such a shift, moving away from near total reliance on the US and leaning toward Europe and China, would have been unimaginable only a few years ago. And now it's unfolding in real time. Which raises the big question: is Canada's shift away from the United States a smart hedge in an unpredictable world, or a gamble that could backfire with its most powerful neighbor? That's where this story pauses, but my request to you begins. This channel has no sponsors, no corporate backing, no safety net. It only exists because of people like you. If you believe independent voices matter, if you believe truth shouldn't be for sale, then I need your support. Subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video. Every click and every interaction tells the algorithm that independent reporting is worth amplifying. It may feel small, but together it's the only way channels like this can grow, and the only way truth can endure.